For a Pennsylvania representative for MAIPC or MAIPC, depending on who you have pronounce it. Um, I work for Pennsylvania's Bureau of Forestry, and one of my duties is to try to handle invasive plants infestations on state forest land. And in the lack of any larger jurisdictional body in Pennsylvania, other than our Department of Agriculture, which has noxious weed jurisdiction, I find myself trying to step up and fill that role in Pennsylvania as best I can, along with some of my coworkers and obviously other partners through organizations like the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council. And so I just thought it would be interesting for folks to hear a little bit of an overview of biological controls of invasive plants. I know that's something that kind of is a topic that comes up relatively often, that people are interested in seeing what's out there and how things go. It's certainly a question that I get quite often in my job working for Bureau of Forestry. So I just figured, even though I'm not an entomologist, I'm not a bug expert. I deal a lot with the invasive plants, and so I wind up kind of doing a lot of digging into some of these biocontrols to try and find out what's been used and what hasn't been, and what could be coming in the future. So here's a quick synopsis of what I've found out over the years, and some of this has also come from people in this group like Mark. So with great gratitude towards the giants whose shoulders I stand on. Here we go. So first, obviously, as I already kind of mentioned, and most of you probably already figured out, this is the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council. So if anyone's interested, you can find our Facebook page, or I believe the website link there should work. And as I already mentioned, I work for the Bureau of Forestry, and kind of gave a little bit of a summary there that, we are not the jurisdictional agency for invasive plants. We are actually the jurisdictional agency in Pennsylvania for conserving native wild plants. And obviously one of the big threats to them is invasive plants. And so that's how I get kind of looped in here as this being important for my job. And so I went over this last time, but we have over 3,000 plant species in Pennsylvania. About 2/3 of those are native. And almost about 500 of them have a legal status in Pennsylvania. That might just be that it's tentatively undetermined. So we have about 150 of those species where we're literally uncertain if it should have a legal status, or what that legal status should be. We're trying to find out more information about that species, the number of populations, the size of the populations, what kind of trajectory they're on, what kind of threats are impacting them. And more recently, we've been trying to whittle down that list and either add things to like Pennsylvania rare, or more threatened or endangered rankings, or delist species. But still, almost a quarter of our native species in Pennsylvania are of limited populations or limited population size in Pennsylvania, and therefore are some kind of special concern species. And a lot of those are being negatively impacted, as I mentioned, by invasive plants. And so one thing I didn't do last time, but I figured I'd do it this time, is give that quick definition of an invasive plant. Is a species, as the Bureau of Forestry sees it, that is not native, spreads quickly and aggressively, and causes harm, and generally economic, environmental, or human health harm. We hear oftentimes a lot of people talk about some of our native ferns acting invasively in the understory, or maybe goldenrod acting invasive in a field. You actually see that picture the bottom left of Phragmites patch surrounded by very aggressive goldenrod. And we always tell people that, we do not consider even very aggressive native species to be invasive, because they are native, they are part of our ecosystems. So that goldenrod in the foreground there, that is not invasive. It might be aggressive depending on the situation, but the Phragmites in the background there taking over that entire wetland is not native, spreading quickly, aggressively, and causing environmental harm. Same thing with the garlic mustard in the bottom right. And I showed this picture last time as well. I love this image that shows basically, once an infestation gets started in an area, typically no one notices it for a long time. It slowly builds its population density and takes over more and more area. And then by the time people become aware of it, or really the public becomes aware of it, it's already taken over a large amount of area, and it's generally really expensive to control. And certainly the Bureau of Forestry, with 2.2 million acres of land, we have more than our fair share of invasives that have gone up that curve and gotten to the point where they are, covering a lot of acres, and it's expensive to control. So for a lot of our infestations in Pennsylvania on Bureau of Forestry lands, maybe even in your backyard, depending on the acreage you've got, we're somewhere there on the infestation curve. So that, we're no longer looking at those mechanical or chemical control options in a lot of instances. It doesn't mean that those don't play a role. If you remember my last talk from last week, I talked about early detection, rapid response. Mechanical and chemical control plays a very important part in management of invasive plants. And these are all different just options. Obviously that chemical control is a little easier on your back than digging out or cutting invasive plants, and gets you better long-term control, but it's also expensive. So once we get to that part on the curve where we're pretty high up there in terms of the acreage covered and the control costs, that's when people start looking at biological controls. So the Bureau of Forestry, we do use biological controls for invasive insects and plants. Unfortunately, there are limited options for effective biological controls. Either that's because they're not effective at controlling what we want them to control, or they might have unintended consequences. So, there were a lot of really, I have written in my notes, half bad biocontrols that were released back in well, before any of our time. So, the 40s, 50s, 60s, where they would release a predator, hoping that it would control a species. And oftentimes these were not formal biological control efforts. These are just some person generally kind of thought this would be a good idea. And so you wind up with all the negative stories of biocontrols we've all heard in the past, where maybe that they were like the cane toad was introduced in Australia to control infestations on sugarcane, and it turns out that the cane toad itself became a worse invasive, just very poorly targeted, very poorly thought out. But now we have much better structure in terms of approving and thinking through that process of approving a biocontrol, and so we do have some that are being used quite successfully. Among them, we have biocontrols that are being studied for ailanthus and then numerous other species. And in terms of plant species, we have biocontrols out on the landscape for mile-a-minute purple loosestrife and spotted knapweed. We are hoping that we will get some more biocontrols here in the future, because they are a successful part of integrated pest management. But it's always a limited. You have to deal with what nature's been giving you. So you only have a limited number of potential predators to deal with, and a lot of study and hard work needs to go into improving these. So just to show some other biocontrols, we have biocontrols for gypsy moth that I have pictured there, and biocontrols for hemlock woolly adelgid. So a little more background on biocontrols. Like I said, there were some half bad efforts early on that kind of gave the whole idea a black eye. More recently, it's much more regulated. You need approval from both USDA APHIS, which is Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, um, and the studies that go into biocontrols. You need to look at the entire range or even likely range of invasive plant. So, for an example, if there was knotweed present and you were looking to bring in an invasive or a biocontrol for knotweed, they wouldn't just look at potential complications within the current infestation of knotweed. They look at where that knotweed could possibly infest in the future based on its climactic range, and kind of look at potential impacts in all of those areas. Um, I'll try to give a better example of that maybe a little bit later, but there's also a process for input from other organizations and agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for any potential impacts on threatened species. And so if you're thinking about that knotweed example, there might be a rare, closely related plant species somewhere far, far away from where our knotweed infestations currently are, but within that climatic range. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service might require additional testing on that rare species for the biocontrol, make sure the biocontrol doesn't impact it, even though it's not currently in an area infested by knotweed, but eventually that knotweed might spread to that area and bring the biocontrol with it, have negative impacts on that rare threatened species. Another thing that people do now is called centrifugal phylogenetic testing. And that's just basically a fancy way of saying they really try to hone in on testing species that are closely related to that invasive plant species, but they do go further out and test less related species as well. And as you get further and further away in terms of relation, you test fewer and fewer species. So a good example of this would just be, for Canada thistle, if you were looking to bring a biocontrol in to help with that one, you would test a lot of our other native thistle species, even if they're not in the same genus, they are in the same family. So you would test a lot of those native thistle species. And you might also test, say, an oak tree species, like in that bottom right. Not that it's highly likely that such a distantly related plant would have an impact, but you might want to test just one oak tree just to make sure, hey, what we're bringing in to eat the Canada thistle isn't going to turn around and start taking bites out of oak leaves, particularly because oaks are a very economically important species. So just kind of a different way to look at that. You're going to be testing, you have that species, that invasive species that you want to deal with the biocontrol. So you're going to look at testing a lot of those other closely related species in the genus. You're going to test some species in that family, and then you're going to start looking at isolated plants from families of economic importance, or very distantly related plant species that are in that similar habitat, to make sure that your biocontrol isn't going to turn around and start eating the neighboring native plants. And so now I'm going to start giving some examples of different biocontrols. I'm going to be totally honest here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on knapweeds and thistles because there's a lot of muddled history, a lot of things that were accidentally introduced or introduced in what we might call the before times, when before people were doing some really good regulation. Some of those that were brought in accidentally or in an unregulated fashion have had impacts on some of our native thistle species. But like I said, this is a kind of a big jumbled mess, and so I'm not going to go over that whole all the different biocontrols that are out there for these species. But I did want to mention at least a couple of them, which are a little bit newer on the scene. And also, I will say that if you look at the end of my presentation, I have some good resources to find out more information on biocontrol species. So the first one I wanted to mention for spotted knapweed and I apologize for butchering the Latin name. I don't speak Latin. I don't think most people do anymore. But Siphocoleonis acatis, which is essentially it is a weevil that's larva feeds on the root of large spotted knapweed plants. And so you've got these big white and brownish black blotched adults. They've got some pretty good size on them. It's hard to see from this picture, but these ones do not fly, I believe. So once you release them in an area, they pretty much stay put and move about slowly on their own. Um, but once they lay eggs on the plant, the larva will burrow into the root and destroy a lot of the root system on that spotted knapweed plant, and does some really good damage, but mostly impacts larger plants with those larger root systems. Um, this one, as well as the next one I'm going to mention, have both been used very effectively out in the Western United States, where spotted knapweed is a lot more of an economic concern, because they have a lot of the dry pasture land habitat that spotted knapweed prefers. Here in Pennsylvania, spotted knapweed is not as big of an economic concern. So, to my knowledge, I could not find any records that anyone had brought this species or the next one onto the East Coast for use. And so we now have some that we are testing on one of our old abandoned and reclaimed strip mine habitats out in central Pennsylvania, um, where spotted knapweed was a significant part of the landscape there due to that land use history there. So we figured we'd try to see if we could get some of these established there. Spotted knapweed is one that you'll see in those kind of harsher, drier environments and climates in Pennsylvania, especially along a lot of our roadsides and right-of-ways. So the next one that I mentioned, Larinus obtusus, this is actually a seed head weevil. So it's hard to see from this picture if you've got a small screen like I do right now. But in the center, in that little ray of light, you'll see the little black weevil. And this one flies around quite readily and lays its eggs on the seed head of the knapweed, where the larvae burrow into the seed head and eat all of the seeds prior to their development and spread on the landscape. So you can kind of see that between these two species, the seed head weevil kind of decreases the seeding rate of the plant, and the root weevil actually destroys the largest plants that, if you think about it, are making the most seed on the landscape. And so here's an example of one of the infestations on our strip mine habitat that was reclaimed. We released it in these areas because we saw that the spotted knapweed was, a lot of our landscapes are very forested. Spotted knapweed is not doing well there in terms of being a economic or environmental issue. But here on this habitat, it's very dry, very rocky, and spotted knapweed was legitimately pushing out a lot of the native plants we'd prefer to see in this habitat. So we did release this about 5 years ago now. And you can see from top to bottom, we have seen a reduction in the amount of knapweed. Now, I want to be extremely cautious in saying the reduction you're seeing here is due to these biocontrols. Biocontrols take years and years, if not decades, to really have an impact. So my suspicion, even though I could leave these pictures in and just say, oh, it's great, worked perfectly, it's all great control. My suspicion here is what's happening in these locations is that we're actually seeing the site become a little bit, as we got some of these plants and other grasses established, they're starting to put down more biological material into the dirt, and starting to have like a feedback effect where the site is not quite as conducive to invasion by spotted knapweed as what it was originally. Hopefully the biocontrols have had some help here. I have not been able to recapture the seed head weevil at this site. I have found that the root weevil is reproducing. I've actually gone out at this site once a year to monitor, and I try to do sweeps for the seed head weevil. And like I said, I haven't been successful capturing them again, but I have dug up large spotted knapweed plants and found the weevils along the bottom of the plant. So they are established at this site, at least the root weevils. The next species, this is the one that I always get questions about. So that was one of the things that led me to kind of put together this presentation. Mile a minute. If you are not familiar with mile a minute as an invasive plant, you are very lucky. It's a terrible annual vine that grows, as they say, a mile a minute, drapes over entire meadow areas, anywhere that's sunny, grows up into trees and starts to drape over all your trees and shrubs. Very aggressive plant. It's an annual, so even if you kill it back one year, any seed bank in that area is just going to resprout the next year. So just a very challenging plant to deal with. And of course, if you come through and you think you're gonna, you see a couple plants and you think you're gonna tear them out by hand, they've got those recurved spines that dig into you no matter how carefully you try to pull them out. I deal with it here at my house, and it's a real pain. So back in 2004, I believe it was down in New Jersey and Delaware, researchers released the first Rhinocommonus latipus, mile a minute weevil as we call it. And you can see some pictures and some weevils here on the tips of the plant. So these are very small. Here's another picture of it. And how this weevil actually acts is it actually starts off as a black weevil, and as it gets older, starts to exude that orange waxy substance on its back. So you'll see it starts to become much more orangey, like you see in this picture here. And so the weevil, actually, the adult weevil does feed on the leaves and can create what we call like a shotgun hole pattern. Other insects can do that as well, like Japanese beetles. So we don't think that's a great determination of whether you have mile minute weevil on your property or not. Instead, how they do most of their damage is they lay their eggs and the larvae burrow into the plant stem, as you see in that bottom picture, particularly damaging the nodes. And so what researchers have found is that most of the damage done to this plant isn't necessarily decreasing the amount of mile minute, it is causing it to have damage at its nodes and grow much shorter and bushier, which gives native plants kind of a fighting ability to compete for sunlight. And I like to tell a story where I went out to a location where the weevils had been released several years previously that was infested with mile minute. And I look at this patch of mile minute and it's growing 8 feet up the trees along the hedgerow, and it's growing over the hedgerow, and you got just some goldenrod and some other really aggressive native plants fighting through for light. And I remember looking at the folks and saying, wow, the weevil just doesn't seem to be doing anything after like 4 or 5 years. And those guys looked at me and they said, yeah, but before the weevil, the plant was 15 feet up into the trees, smothering the trees, and you couldn't see anything poking out from the mile minute patch, much less the goldenrod and some of the other aggressive native plants managing to compete for sunlight. So it takes years and years for this to build up its population to have an effect, but it does have an effect. There are places that have seen really great results from it. And another benefit to this species is that it really establishes well and it really moves well on its own. I think the one research was said that it can travel like 10 miles a year or something like that on its own. So this is one that I tell people, I get a lot of phone calls of folks asking if they can get some, if they can buy some. The answer is yes, you can buy some. If you look up the New Jersey Philip Lampi lab, you can order some. You're going to wind up paying like $1 a weevil. You're going to want at least 100 or 200 weevils to get a population established. But I always tell people, go out and look at your plants before you buy those weevils. If you're anywhere in southern Pennsylvania, chances are, if you see that scarring at the nodes that's caused by the larva, you've got mile a minute at your site already. If you go out in a cool, shady morning, and you walk slowly and carefully up to those plants without shaking them, if you look out at the tips of those newly growing tips on the vines, if you look very closely, you'll see a little black or a little orange weevil. And if you scare them, they'll drop to the ground. That's their defense strategy. So you can't go in there thundering around midday when they're nice and warmed up. You got to go early when they're cool. They're moving a little slower. And look very carefully, and you'll see them in the on the tips of the vines there. And as I mentioned about the shade and cool and moist, those are conditions that the weevil actually does not do very well in, which the shade is okay because mile-a-minute doesn't prefer the shade either. But if we have a cooler, wetter year, that doesn't seem to slow down the mile-a-minute much, but it does really slow down the weevil from reproducing and building up its population. So there are definitely places where I've seen in the last few years some of those cooler, wetter summers we had. The mile-a-minute weevil was not doing its job as well as what we'd seen it do in previous years that were hotter and drier. This last year was very hot, very dry for most of the year, the summer, and mile-a-minute really wasn't a problem at a lot of our infested sites, not to the extent where it was previously. So, and studies have also shown that if you're going to deal with mile-a-minute, and you release the mile-a-minute weevil, what it's doing is just knocking that mile-a-minute back so that native plants can compete for sunlight. So that's something to think about if you're dealing with trying to get weevils in your area or trying to deal with the mile-a-minute infestation. And I just have this picture. This is not how to phrase this. This is data that I've pulled together over the years in talking with other agencies, other folks, trying to pull together places where they have recorded mile-a-minute releases, as well as places the Bureau of Forestry has released mile-a-minute weevils. And so I would not say this is an exhaustive list of all of the mile-a-minute releases across the state. I would bet that, there's been a lot more than this, but you can see at this point, they've been released in a lot of the areas that are heavily infested by mile-a-minute. And like I said, these weevils spread very well on their own. Purple loosestrife, this is one that actually I don't have a lot of new information because a lot of this work was done before my time here at the Bureau, but I did want to at least mention it. There are 4 different species that were released to control purple loosestrife infestations. If you are looking for more information on these than what I'm going to give here, Cornell University's Stacy Endriss, ENDRISS, is one person that you can look up her contact information, try to reach out to, as well as the researcher Bernd Blossy, BLOSSY. So they know far more about these species than I do. But the research that they've done has shown that all 4 species that were released are widespread across New York State. I don't think anyone's done a similar study in Pennsylvania or other states in the Mid-Atlantic yet. But if they're doing well in New York, it stands to reason that they're probably doing well across the range. And they have seen significant decreases in the density of the number of flowering plants, the number of flowers per plant, and the increase in other plant species that can help compete with purple loosestrife at a site. So as I said, all of these releases were done before my time here at the Bureau, so in the late 90s and early 2000s, more or less, because we had purple loosestrife infestations in wetlands that looked like this. So the first 2 species that were released were leaf beetles, the Gallirucellas. And these are the ones that I've actually been able to go out and find evidence for. They feed on those leaves, they leave holes in the leaves. You can find the adults out in daylight on the top of the plants. So you can go out with a bug sweep and find these and move these if you want. I'm not sure that's necessary to start to move this biocontrol around, but it is a possibility. I believe you can also order these online, different sites. And I tried to pull together information over my time of releases that have been done in the past in Pennsylvania from different organizations. I have not gotten as much, I've never found as much data for this one as I have for Mile Minute, partially because these releases were made, like I said, back in the late 90s and early 2000s typically. But what you see there, all the highlighted blue dots are where leaf beetles, the Gallercellas, have been released. There's also the root weevil, which is a very similar life pattern to what I mentioned with the spotted knapweed root weevil. This is one that tends to be nocturnal. I don't believe it is as strong of a flyer. I believe it does fly, but not quite as strongly as perhaps the leaf beetles with the seed head weevils. And this is one, though, it will kill large plants by attacking that root, but it is also a little more sensitive to water table changes. If the plant is inundated in water for too long, I believe it will kill the larvae. So this one, because it's nocturnal, it's hard to find, or the damage is done underground. It's hard to find. I haven't found one of these yet. But you see those blue dots, those are where I'm aware that these were released in Pennsylvania at least. And like I said, the research from Bern Blasi and Stacy Endress has indicated these have all spread and established well up in New York across the state. So I have to imagine they're doing fairly well elsewhere as well. And Nanophytes marmoratus, I just realized I forgot again to change. That should be Nano in that Latin name, in case anyone's looking up more information on these. But this is a seed head weevil, once again, very similar to the seed head weevil for the spotted knapweed. Very strong flyer, moves about quite readily, and once it comes to a patch of loose strife, it will lay its eggs, and the eggs burrow into that seed head, or I should say the larvae are in that seed head and eating the undeveloped seeds before they can spread. And this one, I only have 2 recorded releases in Pennsylvania. One that is currently being studied, one biocontrol, is for Tree of Heaven or Ailanthus. There's been a lot of interest in this one recently, not only because Ailanthus seems to be getting worse across the mid-Atlantic, but also because of the spotted lanternfly really being attracted to Ailanthus. And this is a picture where, like I said, it's a little harder to see if you've got a small screen like I do, but we had a timber sale in one of our South Central districts, and a lot of what you see growing back up from seedlings are Tree of Heaven. When our foresters saw this, they were looking at acres and acres of Tree of Heaven seedlings being the regen that they got, and they were wondering what they could do. Coming through here and spraying the whole site was going to kill the other beneficial regen that they wanted. And then they'd have to look at trying to replant or something like that. So potentially a very expensive problem to deal with. And so, you can see why there's interest in having a biocontrol that is selective for Ailanthus. And so one of the things folks have been looking into is the verticillium wilt. And so on the left, you see a healthy Ailanthus. And on the right, you see an Ailanthus that is infected by the verticillium wilt, Verticillium non-alfalfae. Once again, I apologize for my Latin pronunciation for any of you Latin scholars out there wincing. But this is one that was actually found, to my knowledge, first in one of our Pennsylvania forest districts, because we had a large patch of large infestation of Ailanthus tree die. And so researchers quickly discovered that it was due to this verticillium wilt. I'm not an expert on this, so I can't say for sure, but I don't believe that they think this has come in from Asia or anything like that. I think they think that this was just something that kind of evolved to take advantage of this new niche of the Ailanthus infestations. And one of the things that makes this so effective at killing Tree of Heaven is that Tree of Heaven oftentimes creates root grafts between different trees underground. And so once you get the verticillium into one tree in a stand, it can quickly spread through those root grafts to the other trees. And so we don't have many locations initially in Pennsylvania, but since then, since people have been looking for these symptoms, and to be honest, some folks have been trying to spread this purposely across the state. We have found more of them over the years. It has been found naturally occurring to our knowledge in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Ohio. That's important because this is not something that you can take across state lines. If you're interested in it, you have to be able to find it within that state. And it is lethal, but it needs the opportunity to infect a tree or a stand of trees to do its job. I do want to say here that this has actually not been approved for general use. It's a little bit of a long story, but as a fungus, it is microscopic. And if you look into the EPA pesticide law, anything that's microscopic that is used to kill something has to be registered as a pesticide. So this has not gone through that process yet. But it does seem like there has been more research. I just heard the other day that there's been some APHIS funding given towards researchers to try to get it registered and created into a usable product that can be used to spread legally. So at this point, trying to spread it is not a legal process because you were using essentially an unregistered pesticide. And also, like I said, you cannot spread it between states. There is still a lot of research to go on with this one. One thing that they did look into was when they treated a stand, there would be some trees that didn't die off. And they wondered if there was some kind of resistance going on there. But it turns out that those were just not linked via root grafts. Once they inoculated those trees directly, they were killed off. Some of the research that has been done on this that I should mention is that they did test it on many of our other native tree species, and they did find some impacts on, I believe, Hercules club, striped maple, and I want to say Norway maple, but most of those impacts were minimal and mostly when they were directly infected. So you had to like directly inject them into the tree, inoculate the tree to get those impacts. I did also want to mention that there is from Europe's the CABI organization is studying a mite that can deform and destroy new leaves on Tree of Heaven. And the initial research on that one seems to be pretty hopeful at this point. So there's not a lot out there on that one yet, but that's the species name if you want to look up more information on that one. And so here's just a map of locations I'm aware that the Ailanthus wilt has either been found or has been moved to as part of study efforts to try to figure out how to use it or get it licensed as a pesticide. Another one we get a lot of interest in, that I have a lot of interest in, is the knotweed psyllid, Aphilara itadori, which can be used for Japanese and giant knotweed species. This is one that they've tested out in the UK and Canada, and I don't believe they've had a lot of success. One of the problems was it seems like they had, well, two different issues. First of all, the northern latitudes that those countries are at induced diapause, which basically the insects saw the shortened day length and kind of shut their bodies down for winter before they could really be effective at reproducing and killing knotweed. And the other thing was in testing these, they rear them in labs, and sometimes they wind up having kind of a genetic bottleneck and inbreeding some of these populations. And so they are now doing more testing in the Northeast and they are in 2019 they collected new populations, new seed material, so to speak, from Japan to select for more damage for younger knotweed plants. And so we are still waiting to see how some of this research goes. You can see, a general knotweed infestation, quite aggressive, quite difficult to get rid of. And so you can see why a biocontrol for this species would just be a world of improvement. And in my research, I did find this quote from New York Invasive Species Research Institute, where they had tested release in 2 counties in New York, where they found that the psyllid had successfully laid eggs. And they're testing in some of those other states in different locations. So like I said, I'm waiting with bated breath to see how this goes. Really hoping, because we have a lot of bad knotweed infestations across Pennsylvania, that this would be a huge help for. And once again, because I firmly admit that this is something I come to is very much secondhand knowledge, I just wanted to put down a good contact, Fritzi Grostad. I hope I didn't butcher her name as well as all the Latin in this presentation, but works out at Oregon State University. Be a great source of more information. So like I said, research is ongoing with that species. Garlic mustard is another one where research is ongoing. The biocontrol for this is a weevil, a root weevil, Pseudorhynchus scribicolus. And it's still under review here in the United States, but it has already been released or approved and released in Canada in 2018. So they are still looking at those releases in Canada. They think that it's established at those sites they released it at, but they're not 100% certain yet. And so one way or another, if it does establish in Canada, likely, even if it doesn't get approved in the US, eventually it may just spread down here. Not like we don't have enough garlic mustard between the mid-Atlantic and Canada to keep it fed on its journey. And one of the things the researchers did mention was a challenge in trying to rear this species is they actually have a parasitoid that attacks the root weevil. And so it's like a biocontrol for your biocontrol, which is not ideal. And so they're trying to rear generations as adults and release eggs so that they don't release the parasitoid that infects these root weevils and decreases their ability to control garlic mustard. So just a few images of garlic mustard. The benefit of these root weevils is the ability to control those, let me see if I can show this, the ability to control those first year basal rosettes and attack the root system before the plants can grow and set seed their second year. And like I said, it's not like we don't have enough garlic mustard between us and the mid-Atlantic and Canada, that if it does successfully establish in Canada, like it appears to have, we might be seeing it one way or the other. Kind of a similar story where Canada has already released this, but it's still being looked at in the United States, is biocontrols for Phragmites. And these are Archanera stem-boring moth species. So you can see the larva there boring into Phragmites, and here's an adult moth right here. So this was already released in Canada in 2019. One of the issues is that we do have a Phragmites australis subspecies americanus, so a native subspecies, which is very rare, at least here in Pennsylvania. And the concern was, these Archanera moths could impact our native Phragmites. Unfortunately, it's almost a moot point because the invasive Phragmites subspecies is pushing out our native subspecies across its range. But the research that they did in Canada did find that the females of these Archanera moths did not prefer our native subspecies for egg laying, and also that the eggs did not survive as well on our native Phragmites. So just some pictures of what we're hoping to control. Obviously a very aggressive species that having a biocontrol would be great. There's also research being done for biocontrol of swallowworts. So here are black and pale swallowwort. Here's an infestation. And this species that they're looking into is another moth species, Hypena opulenta. Once again, approved for release in Canada and I believe approved for US release. The larvae eat leaves and defoliate the plant. Hopefully it will be very successful. I believe they've already done limited releases up in Rhode Island to test this out. And so if anyone else has any more information at the end of this presentation, please feel free to chime in on any of these. But it appears to do more damage in shaded conditions. I'm sorry, they got overwintering, but not establishment. And one of the biggest issues with this one appears to be that they all have a pathogen. All our populations of Hypena opulenta have a pathogen. And that really decreases their ability to act as a biocontrol on the swallowwort species. We can't do what we did for some of the other populations and just go get more of these because unfortunately, I believe the Hypena moths are native to Ukraine, which as most folks know is kind of a war zone right now. So they can't just fly over on a jet and pick more up. But if you're interested in more information, Lisa Tewksbury of Rhode Island is a good person to look for her contact information and reach out to. And just a few that I'll mention in passing, there has been studies of a weevil species, Gallericella, I'm sorry, beetle species, excuse me, Burmanica, to help control European water chestnut. One of the hangups on that species is that it's been observed feeding on our native water shield, Brasinia. But kind of their research has indicated that, you know, Brasinia occurs in the native range of Gallericella burmanica and doesn't really seem to be a host species, doesn't really seem to get a lot of damage from burmanica. So hopefully it will be approved eventually, seeing as how, even though there does seem to be some feeding on the water shield, it doesn't seem to be doing much damage to that plant species. But we will see how that research and that decision to do more studies and eventually release goes. I'm not sure how that will fall out yet. Another kind of wrinkle there is that there is a new water chestnut species, Trapa bispinosa, that's been observed, and I was not able to find out if anyone's done research on control of that one with this Gallericella. And Russian olive is another species that people are doing research on. I have even less information on this one other than they're looking at a galling mite that goes after the flowers and shoots. So CABI is a great place to look for more information on that one. I think they're specifically going after the galling mite because they don't want to kill the trees in a lot of instances, but they do want to control that reseeding. Oxeye daisy, folks are looking at a root feeding moth and also a tephritid fly there. So I just wanted to include those names in case anyone's really interested in biocontrol of oxeye daisy. You can probably find more information on those. And similarly, common tansy, folks are looking at a shoot-boring weevil to see if that can be used as a biocontrol. Those last species aren't particularly big issues here in the Mid-Atlantic, to my knowledge, but it's always interesting to see what's going on. Keep abreast of that information. And finally, there are folks that are doing research on species like Kogan grass, which some of you in the southern parts of the Mid-Atlantic probably are familiar with. Chinese privet. Japanese stiltgrass, which has always been a focus of research. Right now, there are folks looking into some of the rust fungi that have been found on it in Asia. So I'm hoping that those research efforts will come to fruition because, you know, gosh, Japanese stiltgrass is another one of those annual species that is just really difficult to control. Biocontrol would help us out a lot there. Arthrax and hispidus, small carpet grass. There's another fungus that has been found infesting that. And so while I don't consider that one to be as bad of an invasive in our area in Pennsylvania as stiltgrass, it would still be great to help control that one because I have seen some of our wetland areas be just overrun with small carpet grass. And folks are also looking into potential biocontrols for lesser celandine plant species that infest a lot of our rich woodlands, especially in riparian areas. And so I just want to pause here for a minute. If you are interested in finding out more information, like I said, I'm well aware that my knowledge is not full and complete. I'm very much looking at this from my own perspective of what the Bureau of Forestry could use in the future. But I find it a fascinating area to learn more about and to keep informed on what's coming up. But so here are some different resources that you can look into if you want to find out more information on some of these. There's a lot of different species out there, far more than what I managed to go into now. I really recommend the middle one there, the Biological Control of Invasive Plants in the Eastern United States. That's a great publication with just really exhaustive information on a lot of our species. So if folks want, I can come back to this slide, but I'd like to just end now. Not because I really need a picture of myself up there or my sons on one of our hikes, but I just wanted to provide my email address there in case anyone wants to email me. Feel free. I'm not sure how much more information I can provide, but I can at least look in some of my publications and find more information for you if you're interested in anything. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much for your time.
It's good to see what you looked like with the haircut.
It's been a while.
So yeah, we have a few questions. One, just quickly, since you had those resources up on that last page, you had a couple names from Cornell that you didn't have listed, but you spelled them out. I remember one was Bern Blasi. There was a woman, I think.
Stacy Endris, Endriss.
All right, thank you. Do you know if people can purchase the spotted knapweed? Just for people who aren't familiar, knapweed and knotweed, different things. That's why he covered them at different points. So do you know where people can get the spotted knapweed root weevil from?
Yes, you can go online. I am blanking. There used to be two different organizations out in Western United States. I want to say out of Minnesota. But they were basically biocontrol. I'm going to blank on it right now, but biocontrol.org or something like that. But if you look up those species names and biocontrol for sale or something like that, those places should pop up. Like I said, the spotted knapweeds were a much bigger issue out in the Western United States because of that drier, rockier soil conditions. And so I think that was a big impetus to releasing them and spreading them out in Western United States. But if you look that up on Google, there is at least one business out there that is able to ship them to Pennsylvania, has all the permits and everything like that lined up. So, yeah.
Allison had a great, interesting question. She asked if anybody's ever done a bioengineered biocontrol.
Not to my knowledge. I think that's still well beyond us. However, as I kind of mentioned in this, my interest in this is both professional as well as I find it really fascinating to keep up on this topic. And I've been following the information on some of the ideas behind like gene drives based off CRISPR technology. And none of that is, quite where it needs to be, but it's really fascinating to see some of that new technology in terms of bioengineering be a possibility in the future.
She also asks if there would be a need in the future to remove the biocontrol species. Like, will the need be gone? Will they then have to be pulled out manually, or what?
Well, that's one of the benefits of the biocontrols, and I probably should have mentioned this a little bit better. Is like the mile-a-minute weevil. Once we release it out in the landscape, the studies have shown that it might take a couple bites out of some of our other polygonum species, native species, but it will not reproduce on them. And so it's really tied into the boom and bust of mile-minute weed itself. So if there's not enough mile-minute on the landscape, there's not going to be much habitat for those weevils, and its population will crash. And so you wind up with these biocontrols not necessarily ever running out, completely eradicating the weed species, but you wind up bringing it down into kind of part of the ecosystem, into a balance, because now you've introduced a predator, essentially. And we're never going to get to the point where we're going to need to pull the mile-minute weevil out or get rid of it, because it's just kind of part of our ecosystem now. It's in sync with that mile-a-minute weed, and its population is going to track the mile-a-minute population.
So you spoke, mostly about finding species from the native ranges, which makes sense. Is there much research in native biocontrol of invasives?
Like I said, I'm not as familiar as I should be, but I believe the verticillium wilt for Ailanthus was not. I don't think they believe that came in from its native range. I think they found that developed here on its own, and I could be wrong about that. So please don't please don't take that to the bank or start saying that. But for the most part, we are looking in the native ranges because evolution takes time to develop those specific host relationships, and so oftentimes that we haven't had time to develop those in our ecosystems with native species relating to those invasive species.
Last question. Someone commented just that William says he's pretty sure the verticillium wilt is a native soil fungus.
Yeah, and like I said, I believe it is, but and we have tons of different verticillium species. So I believe this one is naturally occurring, but I would not rely on my word on that. Actually, probably one of the best people to reach out to is Kristen Wickert, Wickert. I believe she's now working down at West Virginia for their Department of Agriculture, I believe. And she'd be a great person to reach out to because she did some of the research when she was a student at West Virginia University. Penn State's researchers have also done some of the work, but I'm blanking on the researcher their name. But anyway, so yeah, like I said, I think it was naturally occurring, but I'm not 100% on that right
now. Last question: do you know of any research done on biocontrol for India strawberry?
I believe that's Duchesnia. I do not know of any that's been done for that one now. That's never popped up. I have that around my house, and that's never popped up in any of the information I've seen on biocontrols. And I think I would have noticed it. So I don't believe anyone has done much work on that one. And I should say that's a big issue here is just, biocontrols are often not, except there often isn't a species that is specific enough to the host plant, or there isn't one that can be useful or can establish well. And so, there oftentimes there just isn't a good biocontrol candidate. And so there's not a lot of research that gets done on this. It's expensive, it takes time. Even once you get biocontrol species, that's a great candidate. Once again, it takes time to establish and really do its job. So, we need more research in this area. And I don't believe anyone's done any for Duchesne yet.
Just one comment to people who might be interested. When you mentioned Kristen Wickert, I think she's either on under a pseudonym or she's coming on later as an attendee, and then to potentially be one of us on the board. Someone also just asked if there's anything this person should be doing to encourage the public and volunteers that would help encourage research on biocontrols.
The road answer there is, write to your Congress people, your legislators, because more funding from governments that is tied towards those long-term research efforts is helpful. Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of the work's been done by our research institutions, but if we did have some more federal or state money going directly to that cause, it's hard, I think, for private industry to do a lot of that research themselves, because the immediate payoff isn't there.
And it's also worth pointing out that stuff like this tends to be pretty bipartisan.
Yes.
And okay, finally, one last question. A guy with a similar name as mine. Any biocontrols for Paulownia?
Not to my knowledge. And I could be very wrong on that. I would like to think that I would have noticed had I seen any successful biocontrols for that one, but I could be wrong. I'd have to look back. Probably the best source for me to look into, which it's in my office, and I haven't been in my office for a long period of time, is that biological control of invasive